It's such a privilege to take a few minutes and share with you some thoughts that I've had in regard to what I call the dangerous process. The dangerous process. I personally think that these thoughts need shared all across America. I think especially in the church. A few weeks ago I preached a sermon on this topic, and at the end of the sermon I made the statement to a prayer partner of mine, that sermon needs preached in every church in America. And it wasn't because I preached it. It was because it's thoughts that are very much in the center and hitting dead on the bullseye of what's wrong in America. And what's unique about these thoughts, it isn't just that the churches need it, even though they badly need it. I think this is a message that's needed in society. The dangerous process. There are four things I want to talk about, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the first two. But the first one is, in the dangerous process, is lying to yourself. I think that people are unaware of the way they lie to themselves. You know, an animal isn't capable of lying to himself. We're the only creature. We're made in the image of God with a soul. We're the only creature that can truly deceive themselves. We'll often say, me, myself, and I. How many people are involved there? Obviously, we're body, soul, and spirit. We can deceive ourselves. And I think that people get caught in that without realizing it. And I think it's a mass problem in our country, and especially the church today. If you continue to lie to yourself in your lifestyle or about an issue, you will then move into the stage of blindness. And I personally believe that blindness is at epidemic proportions across America. You move into blindness, and you will stay in blindness unless you are confronted. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit later on, but confrontation is what has to take place to break blindness. I think many people in society, many people in our churches, in some places a majority, are living in blindness. If you stay in blindness over a period of time, you will then enter into hardness of heart, where the heart cannot receive truth, where the seeds of truth bounce off and cannot penetrate the ground to produce something in your life. And that's a dangerous state to be in. But there's yet another stage that I think some enter into, and possibly in our society today, many enter into, and that's the state of being reprobate. It starts with lying to yourself. Inner blindness, then hardness of heart, and then a state of being reprobate. Reprobate is a word we don't often use in our vocabulary today, but it means to be void of judgment. When a person becomes reprobate, they seem no longer to have a conscience. They aren't able to tell the difference between right and wrong, and that is a very dangerous state. Let's just take a minute and go back to lying to yourself and talk about that. What does it mean to lie to yourself? And there are hundreds of examples of this, but I'm going to give some real obvious ones that will make clear the concept. I think addictions are a huge way that people lie to themselves. How often have I counseled someone, or you've encountered someone that says, oh, I can quit drinking anytime I want. They're drinking an enormous amount of alcohol. They're intoxicated most of the time, but they can quit anytime they want to, whenever they decide, they say. Lying to themselves. We've seen this over and over and over. I think inappropriate relationships, it's very easy to lie to yourself. This is also at epidemic proportions across America. This isn't hurting anyone, despite the fact that it's totally against God's laws, despite the fact that Scripture is crystal clear about the right and wrong of the whole issue, in an inappropriate relationship. But you know, this isn't harming anybody, or this is because of my background. Pastor, the reason I do this is because of what I've been through. I wonder how many times I've heard that. You know, if you knew what I've been through, you would then understand why I do this. And therefore it justifies it in some way. Rationalization. So inappropriate relationships. I think a very sensitive one that I'll just address briefly, but I think it's an excellent example. I think that we lie to ourselves about our children often. How many times have I talked to a precious mother, a loving, precious mother who has a son who is a felon, who is in state prison for one example comes to mind, for a very gruesome act. And the first thing she said to me is, "Oh, he's a good boy. He didn't mean any harm." Well, there's no question, with sensitivity I want to say, there's no question that when he was a small child, he was a precious and good little boy. But he's made some choices that are horrible, and we need to be in reality about where he actually is. I can say this with a little bit of authority because I've been through this in my own family. I had to come to the reality that I had a son who was a heroin addict. And I had to look at that straight in the face and say, my son is desperately addicted to heroin. And he actually went through 13 months of rehabilitation. But, I think the man who put together the 12-step program initially understood this, because right in the early stages of that teaching, you have to say, "I am an alcoholic." And in our day and age today, I think there's a rationalization justifying wrong, and we lie to ourselves, and that's dangerous. I think we do that in our parenting. Maybe we spend an hour a week with our son, but it's on a bowling league, and so when someone says, "How are you doing in raising my son?" "Oh, I spend Friday nights with him." Where the truth is, we spend very, very little time each day, and we're neglectful. So a lot could be said about that. But I think in parenting as well, secret sin, I think I could say a similar thing about secret sin as I said about addiction, that whether it be pornography, there's 100,000 secret sins that people will justify. Well, if you knew the state of my marriage, you'd understand, Pastor, why I do this. If you understood what, some of the difficulties, and you understood some of the things going on inside of me and how I'm chemically made. That's another one that people often say. You would understand me doing this. I need to do this. And that can even border on a criminal mindset. In the criminal mindset, it's that, well, I'm an exception. And I won't go into that now, but I think that could even border into that. So there's a lot of areas that we lie to ourselves. Now, the danger of that is, if you continually lie to yourself, you will enter a stage of blindness. And I believe after 30 years of being a pastor and spending hundreds of hours with people, and I'm certainly no expert, but I've come to the solid conclusion that epidemic is an absolute, or blindness rather, is an absolute epidemic. It's an epidemic proportions in our society today. In the church, it's horrible. The blindness. You lie to yourself long enough and you become blind to yourself. Someone can present the truth to you, and the word itself, blindness, of course, implies that you don't see. And the Bible speaks of that. Jesus addressed blindness all throughout Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think the best example of blindness that I can give is the example of King David, the man after God's own heart. And I need to say a couple of things about that. David was an awesome man of God. Imagine being referred to in the Scripture as a man after God's own heart. I would love to have that said about me, that I was a man after God's own heart. I don't know of a higher compliment that could be given than that. He's the sweet psalmist. How many hundreds and thousands of people know nothing about the Bible know the 23rd Psalm? And David was the sweet psalmist of Israel. But there's an incredible story in 2 Samuel, chapters 11 and 12, that illustrates lying to yourself and blindness. David, in a wartime, was out on the balcony, walking around on the top of his house, a stressful time of his life, relaxing in the evening. And he saw Bathsheba across the way, also out on the roof of her house, bathing, and lusted after her, being the king and taking privileges he shouldn't take. He brought her to his home, committed adultery. She was a married woman. Committed adultery, and she became pregnant. Now, how could he justify that? A man after God's heart, how could it's lying to yourself? I don't know all of his thought process, but it's wartime, I'm stressed, this is a difficult time, I need a little rest and recreation, on and on and on it goes. After all, I am the king. There's a number of directions he could have gone, and we don't know, but we know he lied to himself, because then it escalated, and sin does that. he realized he was really in a predicament. He realized that this woman's pregnant and she has a husband, Uriah, who is off at battle fighting for the country. And so he plans a scheme. He brings Uriah back and offers him some rest and recreation and some time with his wife, with the idea that, he'll spend time with his wife, he'll be intimate with her, and then I can get out of this thing and it'll look like the baby is his. Uriah, being a very godly man, chose not to go back with his wife. Didn't go to his own bedroom that night because he said, how can I go and enjoy the comforts of home and intimacy with my wife when my own men are fighting? A just man. So what's David do? David sends him to the front of the battle through order of his general, and Uriah was killed. So here we have the man after God's own heart. How do you get in a mess like that? How do you get in a mess like that where you're a man after God's own heart and you've covered up adultery and murdered a man? Nathan the prophet in 2 Samuel chapter 12 comes to David, and this is the best example of blindness I've ever seen. He tells David a story. He said there was a very, very wealthy man who had lots and lots of sheep and a beautiful farm. In the same town, there was a very, very poor man who had one little ewe lamb that was his own pet. In fact, this pet was so precious to him that it sat at his table with them and ate of their food. A traveler came through to stay at the rich man's house. The rich man wanted to prepare a nice meal. He went to the poor man's house, took his only ewe lamb and killed the lamb and prepared a meal instead of taking his when he had much. When David heard that story, it says David was angry and said, "Who is this?" And to paraphrase a little bit, I'm going after him. He's going to be judged for this sin. A key thing happened right then. A confrontation happened that broke the blindness. Nathan the prophet pointed to him and said, David, you are the man. When he said that, something happened. The blindness was broken. And David saw his sin. And in Psalms 51, we read the marvelous story of David's prayer, where he begged God for forgiveness, took personal responsibility. If you go and read Psalms 51, and I would encourage you to do that at some point, he's pouring out his heart, not blaming any circumstances, no longer lying to himself, not blaming anyone else, but taking full responsibility. He even said, against thee and thee only have I sinned, O God. But what broke that blindness? Confrontation. And I need to stop here to say something about that. This is an area where the Church of Jesus Christ across America is totally dropping the ball. Society is dropping the ball. Confrontation in our modern era has become totally socially unacceptable. It is absolutely wrong to confront somebody. You're judging. You're out of line. If you go to somebody that's in an inappropriate relationship and you say to them lovingly, and it needs to be done lovingly, hey, I've made mistakes of my own, and I know that I've messed a lot of things up in my own life, but you're also doing that. Oh, that is no way in our world today is that accepted. It is not accepted. And this has been a trick of the enemy. It says in Ephesians that the devil is a schemer, and he schemes to undermine truth. And the enemy has us in a frame of mind in our churches today where it is absolutely wrong to confront someone. What's the result of that? People remain in blindness. We have accountability here to go to people. People remain in blindness. And in Revelation chapter 3, it speaks of the last days church. I personally believe we live in the last days church. Revelation chapter 3, it refers to the Laodicean church, and I believe that's also a church age. I believe it's the age we live in. And it's interesting that in Revelation chapter 3, it says that you need to anoint your eyes with eye salve so that you may see, because you're blind. And I do believe that blindness is at epidemic proportions across America. But the enemy has duped us into thinking that it's wrong to confront anyone. You're being judgmental. I think that's a favorite of people's. So it's very important to see that. And I wonder as I talk if you search your own heart, in one area have you entered into blindness. Now if you stay in blindness and you're not confronted and that isn't broken, and we as a church and friends and parents have responsibility there, you will enter into the stage of hardness of heart. I've often seen this. Someone attends a church service, you're pouring out truth, you're preaching your heart out, you're giving truth very pure and very solid. The person is sitting there with a life of sin. So many things you're saying apply to their situation. They're nodding and smiling. They come up to you after church, they shake your hand and say, that was a wonderful sermon. And as they walk away, you say, how in the world could they not see themselves in that message? But hardness of heart has come in. The seed is bouncing off of a hard heart. And that, my friend, is a dangerous state to be in, and it follows blindness. If you continue with hardness of heart, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you enter the next stage, I would say you're really in deep trouble, reprobate, where your hardness of heart turns to void of conscience, where you don't really decipher right and wrong anymore. In Romans it speaks that there'll be people who don't know the difference between right and wrong. And I think that's happened. They can do the worst thing in the world and turn over and go to sleep and feel no remorse. And I think it explains a lot of the things we see happening across our country. I think people have entered that stage. But remember, it starts with lying to yourself, repeatedly lying to yourself. Then blindness. If blindness isn't broken, hardness of heart, and reprobate. And I'm not going to spend a long time on reprobate. Felt like blindness is the important topic for today. May address those others at another time. But I would encourage you to mull over these thoughts. Turn to Revelation chapter 3 and read about the blindness there. Go back and read the story of David. I think that's good for us to look in the mirror of God's Word. James chapter 1 says that the Word of God's like a mirror. When we read that truth, often we see ourselves. We don't want to walk away without making any changes, as it says in James. We want to adhere to the Word. So I would encourage you to take some time and think on these thoughts to see if, in fact, there are things you are lying to yourself. Thank you.